Okay, guys, so this is going to be just kind of a brief overview of everything that we've talked about for the last week. Um, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if there's anything more specifically that you need to know that I've forgotten, I will make sure that I cover it in the exam review. Um, so, again, this is just going to be kind of brief, so if you have any other questions, let me know and I will answer them for you. So, the first thing we're going to kind of talk about is going to be genetically modified foods and genetically modified organisms. So, the first thing, I guess I'll kind of talk about food first. So, genetically modified organism is going to be a GMO, and then anything that is genetically modified, you can just assume stands GM. Um, so, the big thing with that is that it's very an opinion based, I guess, category right now or topic. And so um, it's really for you to kind of decide based on research that you do. But just to help you understand the few things that are good and bad scientifically about it, is that why people do it is you can change like the outcome of a crop so that it has resistance to specific bugs or to the weather, things like that. So it helps with the growth of the plant as well as production so that you can produce more in a shorter amount of time. It goes into profit as well as um, consumer consumption so that people can be fed. A few things that are a problem with it is it decreases variation of a crop and then it can cause resistance that can cause problems health wise. That's really all you need to know about that. Uh, there's this term called transgenic organism. So that is basically when you take a gene from one organism and then you incorporate it into the genome of another. So that's basically genetically modified. That's what that is. So we're going to talk about Dolly the sheep and cloning just to kind of give you a little overview of it. So this is Dolly, or I guess the parent donor of Dolly. And then this is another sheep that will be the foster mother. So basically, what happens is they take um, a cell from a donor sheep and then they will remove the nucleus of the egg cell that they take from another sheep. So then you have the nucleus of the donor cell in there. So the donor cell's DNA is the only one in there, and then they fuse those and then it makes an embryo, and then the embryo will kind of clone or not, excuse me, not clone itself, but will start to divide normally and produce a larger organism. That embryo is then induced and placed into the uterus of a donor mother, so the foster mother, and then is given hormones to kind of make the body think that it is pregnant and has been pregnant and produce this so that it can provide the nourishment and everything that that embryo needs. And then the embryo will develop into a lamb, and that will be Dolly. And Dolly is an exact genetic replica of this sheep up here. So, really, that's just kind of the basic overview of cloning. That's all you really need to know about it. I just wanted to kind of explain it a little bit. It's actually a very cool process. We're going to talk about gene therapy. So you have gene therapy is basically replacing damaged genes with good ones. So you have germline, which is like in the embryo, and then you have somatic cell, which can be basically just in any cell in the body. It can repair itself with the new good genetic information after it's been put in. That's really all you need to know about that. So, evolution, we talk about the main questions are who are we? Where did we come from? And it's kind of been a sensitive topic for a lot of people, not so much in recent years, but before that, it was a very big deal, especially when it came to religion and kind of trying to understand how God played a part in everything. So, this is going to be the kind of the science background of it. So basically, evolution is a change in characteristics of a population over time, and it doesn't just happen in like like a single individual. It takes a very long time, so it's generations of time. Um, so you have biological theory, which is basically a change in groups of living things over many generations, which we kind of talk about with the natural selection, which we haven't discussed yet in class. We will be tomorrow. Um, but basically, natural selection, it's an adaptation to an environment. So it kind of helps with survival of the fittest. The organisms that have the most, I guess, the characteristics that help them survive better are typically the ones that will reproduce and survive. And then, as that happens, the characteristics in the population kind of shift towards that, so that the survival is bigger for the population. One thing is just like the flu or the influenza. You have to get a flu shot every year because there's different strains of the virus that are the most common during that flu season. But once you get that immunization, you are resistant to that strain of the flu forever. So that's kind of amazing that there's that many mutations. I mean, I'm 22, and so I've gotten a flu shot probably almost every year, and I still get the flu consistently. So that kind of is a crazy thing to kind of realize. So another thing, this is just kind of going into the evolution, the facts kind of stuff of it. So there's this dude named Lamarck, and he believes that inheritance of acquired traits is what is passed on to offspring. And this is not correct. This is not a right theory. It was discredited. So what he thought was happening was that if you learned how to play the piano in your lifetime, your kid would be born knowing how to play the piano, which would be awesome. That would maybe make me want to learn to play the piano. But the thing is, that doesn't happen. So we call it bodybuilder babies because it's like if you have a bodybuilder mom and a bodybuilder dad, you're not going to expect your baby to be born with huge muscles and be able to bench, and things like that. So that's why that theory is not correct. Charles Darwin, however, he came up with some good theories. So he's basically credited with the theory of evolution. So he was an English guy. He went on a voyage for 5 years, and it was on a ship called the Beagle. And basically, he observed differences in species and populations. So one of the big ones is that he studied finches on the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that in different locations on the island, the finches looked different. And it was based on like what type of food they had access to and what type of predators they had, things like that. So, for example, like on one part of the island, if the seeds that the finches would eat were very large and hard, he noticed that the beaks of the finches would tend to be thicker and wider. And then he noticed on another part of the island that when the seeds were small that the finches would eat, they would typically have really long, thin beaks in order to get the food that they needed. So that's kind of what started the thinking, but it took him 20 years to actually decide what he wanted to do with that and kind of figure it out. So after 20 years of after that observation, he came up with the idea, and then he published The Origin of Species. So the main two things that he really contributed were the theory of common descent, which is basically, I will show you, where you have everything, every living thing stems from a common ancestor. So as you can see here, this was the common ancestor, and it kind of broke off into branches. So then things differentiated over time based on different things. So you have eukarya over here, which that's where we would be because we're multicellular organisms. And you can see you have fungi, plants, different things like that. So that is the theory of common descent, that everything comes from a common ancestor. The other thing that he kind of came up with, which we will talk about in class, is the theory of natural selection. So don't worry about that yet, but basically natural selection is survival of the fittest. It's the organisms that are more fit or able to survive in their environment are the ones that move forward. There are a few things that go on with common descent. So when that was presented, it was a little bit hard for people to accept based on two things. So the first one is special creation, which is where people had a hard time kind of being able to accept both, or thinking that they had to accept one or the other, where special creation is where people believed that God created the earth in like how he did in the beginning of the Bible. In Genesis, how it talks about what God created on what day. So that was kind of hard for people to move past, especially when that's what they'd believed for so long. The next one is intelligent design. So a lot of people believe too that life and organisms and everything that we have is too complex. It's too complicated for there to not be a God, for there to not be a higher power. And it's really a great thing, and it's for everyone to decide for themselves. But I personally believe that science works through God, and that is how it works. I believe that God contributed everything he did through science, and that's why I love studying it, because as I study the nitty-gritty and the very small microorganisms, they're so complicated, and I do believe that God created it the way he did for a reason, and that it is through science. Just had to throw that in there. A few things I'm going to talk about next are, there's 4 different theories of the origin of modern organisms. So these are the 4. I would know these diagrams and be able to know which one is which. So the first one is the static model. So that is where species arise separately from each other and they don't change. So as you can see here, like this white flower stays white over time. There's no change. And it's not even remotely related to this tree, which stays the same over time, or this butterfly or moth. Okay, that's a static model. Then you have the transformation model, which is where you have organisms still arise separately from each other, so they're not related, but they do change over time based on the changing environment. So this pink flower over time becomes white because of the environment change. This short tree becomes tall. Makes sense? The next one is going to be separate types. So this is where you have species that change over time, and new species can arise from previous species, but they have different ancestors based on the type that they are. So as you can see here, this one can produce a flower in a tree, and the fish could, have stemmed into a lizard and a monkey. Okay. This is the common descent model as well. So basically that one is that the species do change and new species can arise, and that they all derive from a common ancestor. So those are the 4 species, the 4 hypotheses about species and how they arise. I would know all of those diagrams and know which one is which and be able to explain what they are. Okay, so that's that. We're going to talk about this guy named Linnaeus. He came up with this classification system for every living thing. So obviously it's been tweaked over time, and it's still being tweaked, and it could be completely different in a year, 5 years, 10 years. But this is a basic system called the Linnaean classification system. And then we also use binomial nomenclature. So this is the Linnaean classification system. So you go from the most broad to the most specific. So domain, I always kind of just don't worry about, because it changes. It's changed since I was in high school, the groups. So typically you will hear that you have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya as the domains, but then they've kind of combined those at one point and then just left that one. So don't really worry too much about that, except knowing that we are of the domain eukarya. Okay, so I love mnemonics, and I'm going to even leave out domain, because if you remember that's first, you're fine. But the mnemonic is for the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So my mnemonics are: kings play chess on fine-grained sand, which a lot of you who took biology in high school, that's probably the one that you know. Another one you could use is keep pond clean or froggy get sick. However you want to remember it, just do, so that you know what order they go in, and that it goes from more broad to more specific. The binomial nomenclature, the way that you can like name like scientific names for things. So, for example, we're Homo sapiens. So that is the genus and the species put together. So an example of that would be, so if we're talking about cats, for example, let's say we're talking about lions and leopards. So the lion, the genus for the lion and the leopard is Panthera, okay? Panthera for big cat, okay? But the lion is going to be Panthera leo, and the leopard's going to be Panthera pardus, okay? So basically, that takes the genus and the species, and that's how you would classify an organism based on the binomial nomenclature system. And you don't need to know those. Obviously, Homo sapiens should be one that you know, but if you understand that it's the genus and species that make that up, you should be good. A few last minute things is just that some terms is homology. So that basically just means similarity. So any similarities in characteristics resulted from a common ancestor. So just kind of remember that. We've used other words that have, if you can break that down, you can really kind of figure out any question if you can break down some of the terminology. So remember when we talked about homozygous or homozygote, the homo in it means same or similar, right? So they're the same or similar characteristic. So just remember that. We use comparative anatomy to kind of organize like biological classification. So if you compared a bat wing to a human arm, you could kind of see the differences in the anatomy of it and see how closely related they could be. Vestigial traits are useful in one organism but not useful in another, or previously had a purpose but no longer do. So tailbone is a good example of that. We don't have tailbones anymore. Sometimes you have a small extension of one that they remove when you're born. Or another example would be like your appendix. At one point that probably served a purpose, but since we changed our diet or the environment changed or different things like that, we no longer need it, which is why when we have a problem with it, we can have it removed and it doesn't cause any problems for us. Two more things to know is that chimpanzees are 99% genetically similar to humans. That is a crazy close amount of genetic relation. The last thing is that we talked about Lucy. She's a hominin, and I would know and recognize, you're not going to have to spell it, but I would recognize that term right there. That is the scientific name for Lucy. And I would know that she was found in Africa about 3.3 million years ago. Basically, she's kind of the only full fossil that we have that would represent evolution, that would show evidence for a common ancestor and speciation and all sorts of things. So she's a very important key component of our theory of evolution. That's everything I'm going to talk about. If you have any other questions, let me know. Like I said, we'll talk about it in the exam review if you don't understand. So good luck, and we will see you.